It's on the board! And is that a checkmate in 3 by force?
This is why we love the World Cup. The top guys beating down on the little guys. This is what we came to see. No more perfect defence from 2750 plus. We want to see Magnus smashing people up, finding brilliancies to finish the game. Now he was playing here against the Georgian player. Let me try and pronounce this. So it's Levan Pantua. So he's from Georgia, 2564. Strong player in his own right, but not in Magnus's league. So Magnus kicks off with c4. He only even needs a draw. He won yesterday, but okay, he's going for a win. So this English opening, symmetrical, and now g6 played. And I like what black goes for here, which is something a bit different. He knows he'll get positionally crushed against Magnus, so let's try and make it tactical. Now the normal move here is taking that pawn, but instead bishop g7 is played. Magnus takes the space, and after d6 we get e4. So a brave decision, giving the world champion the space, the centre, but obviously now black is going to play for some dark squared control. Now e6 is played here. We get pawn h3 from Magnus, stopping any future bishop g4, knight e7, knight c3, and pawn h6. You know, a number of pawn moves here from black. I mean, white's made some too, of course, but not exactly a setup that fills you with tons of confidence. But like said, black wants to play for tactics. Now, Magnus doesn't have to do this, but he takes on e6. The computer just wants to develop a bishop, play with the space, but Magnus's idea is bishop f4, target that backwards pawn, and black responds correctly, ditch the pawn, go for counterplay. So Magnus takes it. We get queen a5, pressure on the c3 knight in combination with this bishop. So the bishop drops, queen drops back, and now knight b4, you know, black trying to start an early initiative. a3 from Magnus, but not yet threatening to take that horse off because the rook is pinned by the pawn, you know, it's loose, it's going to drop. So g5 is flicked in. Kicks back this bishop, yes, lovely. Magnus drops it back. Could have gone there, by the way, could have gone there, different ways to play, but it does weaken this f5 square, which could come back to bite. So we see rook d8, kicks back this queen, and now knight d3 check. Really logical idea. You pick up the bishop pair, and after rook recaptures, look at this pawn, about to drop off the board, plus huge pressure on this knight. So what does Magnus do? He castles the king, good move, gets it to safety. Yes, the pawn drops, but now at least he can start to counterattack a bit. So he opens up the queen, attacking that bishop. It chops on d5. The pawn recaptures and rook takes. So now black is the one who's actually a pawn up. What's Magnus gonna do about this? Well, he goes rook e1, and this stops the black king from castling. And boy, does this get nasty really fast. So queen d8 is played to cover the knight, set up this really nice battery, and prepare to castle. But queen c4 is an excellent move from Magnus. Can you see what happens here if black castles the king? Can you find the winning tactic? So the move to play here is rook takes on e7. You remove the defender of this rook, and then white emerges simply a piece up. So castling is impossible. What does black do? King to f8. Step out of the pin, prepare to move the knight. But now another great move from Magnus, knight to e5. He's just bringing that firepower into the attack. And this rook is now pinned. You know, say for example you went rook d4 to attack that queen. Well, there's mate in 1 on f7. And if you eliminate that knight with the bishop, bishop recaptures, say the rook moves here, bishop f6, you're getting killed on these dark squares. It is not fun. So what we see instead is knight to c6. Very logical. You challenge this strong piece. That knight was a bit miserable there anyway. You know, black was really happy to hop it out the way. But now a really nice move from Magnus, rook a to d1. So using the fact that the rook cannot take here, or you walk into this checkmate. And of course this tactic's only possible because black's not taking with check. So what should black do in response? Well, it's tough. You know, if you take here, well then simply your rook is dropping on d5 because that rook is now attacked. There's a threat to take it, but you can't move it. So what black does is knight d4. Good move. Interrupting the connection here, of course. Magnus now sidesteps, coming away from any nasty discovered checks, and now b5 from black, pushing back the white queen, using the powerful knight on d4, but it's really hard to keep these pawns rolling. You know, there's no c4, this knight gets really loose. What do you actually do on the king side here? You want to get this rook into the game, and so h5 is played, you know, an attempt to sort of bring this one, maybe lift it one day, or push the pawns forward, activate the rook like that. But watch how Magnus now takes over the initiative. So he starts with knight to c6. More use of tactics, more use of pins. So both of these are attacked, and if you take with the knight, well again your rook is dropping. This is the problem. So the queen moves to b6, the knight is attacked, but Magnus doesn't take here. That would be helping black more than it helps white. Instead, he hops with knight e7, and that f5 square is coming back to bite. So the rook drops back and knight f5 played. Still, you can't snap it off. Still, you're then going to lose a rook at the end. And in fact, this is literally a checkmate. You know, look at the unfortunate position of that king. So instead, we see queen g6 played, pressuring the knight, but it's a huge blunder, which Magnus now pounces on. By the way, running back one move, what should black do? Well, bishop f6 was best, apparently, adding defense to the rook. But okay, not easy to see, under some time pressure as well, you know, down to 10 minutes. So queen g6 played. Now, can you find the winning move here, which Magnus plays? It sets up a beautiful finish. So, Magnus plays the move of bishop to c7, and he's trying to dislodge this rook, because if the rook leaves the d file here, say it comes to c8 to attack that bishop, keep an eye on the back rank. Well, now the bishop nudges back with check. It's defended by the knight, so the queen can't take. The king can't move this way, it's completely cut. So this is forced, and then you check like this, and you pick up the queen on the next move. So this is the problem with sidestepping off the d file. If you come to the e file, you know, prepared to maybe chop that knight if it checks from e7 in that whole same sequence. Well, now white can take here, king recaptures, and this is an awesome move. Queen takes on b5 with check, because if knight captures, this is actually a checkmate. The way the pieces flow and take advantage of this king, not castled, no rook on f8, it's really beautiful. So coming back here, we see the rook slide up to d7, staying on the d file, hitting that bishop, but this is where Magnus unleashes a brilliancy. Tanya reacts to the move like this. I'll show you the clip in a second. If you want to pause the video, look for it, then please do so. So, the move that Magnus plays here is rook to e8 check. He sacrifices the rook, and this is the response from Tanya.
It's on the board! Magnus Carlsen with the fantastic rook e8. And is that a checkmate in 3 by force?
So why does this work? Well, the king has to recapture, you know, it's got no other move, and then this is the follow-up, it's queen e4 check. Not only threatening nasty stuff here, but you're also eyeing the a8 square. This is the key to the variation. Now, if the king moves, it's only got one square to go to, then that's how you finish the game. You check from here, the only legal move is a rook block, this is a checkmate. So if we run it back here, the king can't move away. Well, what if you block the check? There's 3 ways to do so. If you block with the rook, that's mate in 1. If you block with the knight, then you still check from the back rank. The rook blocks, and now this piece joins the party because you take with check, knight recaptures is forced, and this is a checkmate. That's the second one in terms of the blocking. And now if you block with the queen, the third possible block, same thing, check from back here, rook blocks, that's a mate on the board. Really nice finish, and remember from this game, always get your king to safety. Cardinal sin. Let's run it back to the final position. Really stunning.
And what on earth has happened? He forgot about knight d6, Peter, because b7 hangs and rook f5.
Another day, another drama in round 4 of the Chess World Cup. So we've got some tasty lineups, including this one, the young German prodigy Vincent Keymer against Magnus Carlsen, former world champion. Now Vincent kicks off with white here. This thing is dry. Dry as an unbuttered Jacob's cream cracker, but stick with it because it explodes into a tense finish. So d4 on the board. We get these standard opening moves of the Queen's Gambit declined. And now we see an exchange variation, and after bishop g5, Magnus goes for a more unusual move of bishop b4. Bishop e7 more common, or c6, or knight bd7. Now this is a kind of positional line, themes of the Ragozin defense, but in that line of the pure Ragozin, the knight's on f3, the pawns haven't exchanged. White carries on with the standard development. We get pawn h6, the bishop drops back, and bishop f5 from Magnus. Really active defense for black. Look at these bishops streaming out, and now the next move feels kind of meek. Bishop to d3, exchanging, queen recaptures, and I've always seen these positions as really dry. Symmetrical pawn structures, well, not exactly symmetrical, but you know, solid and on both sides of the board, looking fine. And how much is white really going to play for with that bishop gone? Well, let's stick with the game. c6, we now get knight to e2. Not the more common f3 square. What's that all about? Well, when I did some clicking, kind of seems to be connected with a3. If bishop takes, you can now recapture with the knight and fight for this key square. So we get knight h5 from Magnus. Good move, challenging that strong bishop. It comes to e5, eyeing the king side, daring black to play f6. Never play f6, in the words of Ben Feingold. Now you're getting absolutely lasered on that diagonal. So we don't see that. We see knight bd7, challenging this one, and h3. Sneaky little move. Now if black captures, it's not good. Pawn recaptures, and it's a really common tactical motif. You've taken away the retreat square of the knight. So g6 is forced. I mean, you can go g5, but that's even worse. To give the knight a retreat square, and now you don't even go g4. The threat is worse than the execution. Just castle, e4 to come. Huge position for white. So no takes on e5. This knight simply hopped back, and now we get bishop h2, saving itself. So we get castles. A3 from Magnus, Vincent. Now bishop a5. It's sliding back to c7 to challenge this piece. We get castles, rook e8, rook ac1, and now Magnus could simply retreat the bishop straight away, supported by the queen, exchange this one. Maybe he felt it was just too dry, right? Didn't want it to get like a camel's tongue up in here. So he goes queen e7 instead. Now, after b4, classic minority attack from white, by the way, launching the 2 pawns against the 3 pawns, trying to induce a weakness on c6, that kind of thing. Well, here the bishop drops back to d8. Now, it looks weird. Obviously, it's not got this square available anymore. But black seems to have this idea of knight b6, looking at c4, then you could go bishop c7, supported by the queen laterally. But after knight g3 from Vincent, heading for f5, well, now Magnus can do this one already. Knight f5 comes, but you can take with check, king recaptures, and only then move your queen. And Vincent drops back. Again, you could say kind of meek play, right? You know, back and forth, bishops exchanged. Meek's going to be about the word of the day, right? What does it mean? Well, it's like weak, but with an M. Okay, there you go. But now queen d6 from Magnus. The knight is pinned to the king, and after the king unpins, he goes pawn a5. Impeccable timing from the former world champion, called him the world champion the other day, slips off the tongue, because if you go b5, which you really want to do, induce this weakness, well, now you drop a pawn simply. So this is the problem. So this is why queen b1, you know, meek, shall I say that again? Timid, weak, you know, passive looking move, preparing to meet the threat of takes. And after knight b6, heading for c4, here Vincent takes on a5. Magnus goes knight c4. preparing to win back one of those pawns. Now queen b4 was played. Of course you don't want to capture, cement this pawn chain, so instead we see rook takes on a5, and now brilliant tactic from Vincent to keep the balance. He's got to be careful here, because if, for example, where's the line? I mean, say whose move is it? It's White's move. Yeah, okay, so he plays a tactical shot. But if he goes for something like takes on d6, well, now he's got this problem of the a3 pawn. It's weak, coming under fire. Black's quite a bit better. So he finds a tactical shot. Do pause if you want to look for it. The best move for White in the position, and this keeps a nice balance. So Vincent plays knight takes on d5. Now in the game, we see knight recaptures. What happens if pawn takes? Well, it's all about the fact that this knight can be taken, which is what the follow-up move is, and then this rook is unprotected, and so is the queen unprotected. So there's now a threat to take the black queen with the white queen, so you've no time to take the rook. And if you do this, well, rook recaptures, a line like this, and white is a pawn up. So coming back here, Magnus goes for the best move, which is knight takes on d5. He's hitting this queen. We see queen takes now on c4, and this pawn drops off the board. The material balance is restored, and after queen c5, we see the queens come off, liquidation, rook e8. It's like the Sahara Desert up in here, right? Heading for a draw, super dry position, but watch what happens. Knight f5. Pawn h5 on the board. You really commonly see that when black or white wants to prepare g6 or g3, but you don't want this pawn to drop. So g6 is coming. Now we see g4, captures, pawn recaptures, rook a2 from Magnus, but after rook b1, challenging the b7 pawn, he now goes rook a1 to force these rooks off the board. So we get captures, takes with check, king g2, king f8, here comes the kings, we're headed for a draw. Pawn g5 takes some space, but here Magnus, to everyone's shock, plays a blunder in an endgame. The endgame goat, just going really wrong. Now what should Magnus play here? Well, he needs to go knight e7. You challenge this strong knight, and if it hops to d6, which we see in the game, well, now you can play pawn to b6, because the knight covers this pawn and it covers the f5 square, which is important. The rook goes away, rook a5 pressures here. You know, this is a sample line, f6. Okay, it's a bit of a passive defense for black, but black is defending. But what we see in the game is knight c7 from Magnus, heading for e6, forking these two, looking for tricks, but he's completely overlooked knight to d6, walking into a trick for white, and this is where you get the reaction of Peter Leko and Daniel Naroditsky.
And
Whoa.
what on earth has
Whoa.
happened?
Magnus Carlsen has blundered. He forgot about knight d6, Peter, because b7 hangs and rook f5.
So what's Daniel referencing here with the rook f5 stuff? Well, first off, your b pawn is attacked, right? And if you defend it with rook to b1, the second problem is rook f5. Both knight and rook converge on this pawn, and how do you defend it? Well, you don't. It's simply dropping off the board. Of course, you haven't even got f6 because of that g pawn which was put there earlier, cramping the black position. So Magnus is in a world of trouble. He goes pawn to g6, taking control of the f5 square. The b pawn drops, and now critically, the c pawn is weak. We get rook b1, hits the knight. It retreats to d8, targeting the c6 pawn, and after rook b5, great composure from Vincent, who is down on time. Look at the clock times on the left. So he doesn't snaffle an extra pawn here with the rook, leave this one to fall with check, make his task a little bit harder. Equally, he doesn't take with the knight, allow Magnus to shatter these pawns, split them. This one could become weak, then it could be a draw. Instead, he takes off the rook. You give black a running past pawn, but he's seen it's the best way to go because this one can be rounded up by king and knight, and then you've got a 4-on-2 over here, plus this one is just cramping two pawns with one pawn. Just an amazing endgame. So knight c6 stops the advance. We get king e8, knight b4, king e7, f4 from Vincent. The black king marches in, but so does the white king. Now Magnus shuffles around with the knight, looking to create tricks, but e4 taking away key squares. He brings it round here, hits the pawn, king defends, knight g7 back, Magnus thrashing, he's in the death throes. Knight d3 on the board, knight h5, the king just slowly advancing. Awesome technique from Keymer, and he even now gets into a position where this one is dropping, but Magnus couldn't just sit there, he has to go for this counterplay. Now this one drops, even b3 is on the board, but super calm move, knight to e5. b2, who cares? There's knight c4 check and the pawn drops off. It's all over for Magnus. He checks, the king goes, now king here, saying take here. I never actually analysed this line. Oh yeah, b2, the pawn runs through. Now you can't get back with king or knight. So that's why the knight is immune here. So we get knight d3, covering the b2 square, knight c3 played, d6, king c6, e5, and Magnus Carlsen resigns the game. Why? Well, these ones are going through and this one is dropping off. I mean, what if knight a4 to support pawn b2? Well, then you can bring the king back, pawn goes, so what? You bring the king, it's dropping, there's nothing to be said, the king can never march in, or this one's running. Obviously this white king is just going to come back, and with knight and king, you've got 4 on 3. I mean, it's absolutely game over, right? Vincent Keymer takes down the former world champion. So this is the climax of Magnus Carlsen versus Vincent Keymer. Their first 2 games, classical chess, they won 1 each. So we've gone to tie breaks. The first 3 of those were drawn. Great fights. Magnus almost won the second, but no results there. So we go to this 4th. We see a decisive result here and an awesome bishop sacrifice. Let's check it out. Magnus with white, and he kicks off here with pawn to e4. Now we go down a Roy Lopez here with bishop to b5, and we follow a similar line to what we saw in one of their earlier games. Now after this move of d3 instead of castles, which you very often see, Vincent now goes for bishop to c5, just how he played before, delaying with b5 here. We see c3, no bishop g5 stuff in this game from Magnus, so he plays very classically. We get pawn b5, bishop b3, d6, castles, h6, rook to e1, castles, and now knight beats d2. So Magnus going on this classic manoeuvring journey, and Vincent for his part going for classic plans. So bishop b6, just nudging back, anticipating d4 and clearing the c file, preparing c5. We get knight to f1 from Magnus, knight e7 now played, c5 on the cards, this one also spinning around to here to support e5. We get knight g3, pawn c5 and a4 from Magnus. Classic idea to nibble away at this pawn structure on the queen side. So rook b8 played, coming out of that pin down the a file. We see pawn h3, knight g6, Magnus exchanges here, and now with Vincent gearing up for d5, if possible, you know, maybe he'd go rook e8 first, but at some point black wants that. Well, Magnus, he now strikes first in the center by pushing on with d4. Black responds with queen to c7, adding some support here, preparing to connect the rooks, but you'll note that this bishop hasn't yet developed. It's not always clear whether it should go to b7 or e6 and challenge this one, depends what white does. And note that Magnus does not close the center here. That would be a positional mistake because black can expand. You've closed off your kind of play in the center here, your attack on the king, and black can now turn their attention to some queenside expansion. So instead, Magnus goes bishop e3, and he's got a really interesting idea in mind here because he's just blocked the rook's defense of this pawn. Rook e8 adds more pressure, prepares to capture here, and what does Magnus do? Well, he doesn't go passive and defend with bishop c2. And when I say passive, you know, it's solid, nothing wrong with it, but instead he goes queen d2. A really interesting pawn sacrifice which Vincent accepts, and that is one of the top 3 lines here the computer is showing. So he takes on d4, Magnus recaptures, and this key pawn, central pawn, drops off the board, but look at how it now opens up this bishop. So Magnus captures, Vincent takes back, and now you can start already with bishop to c2, but instead we see takes on c5, and actually the computer here wants to recapture with the bishop. Even though you leave the pawns looking kind of nasty, it wants to challenge this strong piece. But Vincent plays that very logical capture, d takes on c5, and now Magnus goes bishop c2, and he's seizing a dangerous initiative because the rook is attacked, but there's also ideas of then eliminating this knight and going bishop f4, skewering queen to rook, and that's why rook e8 is just not working here. So that's why Vincent, he now goes for rook to b4. His top move, by the way, was rook e6. And the idea being, if you now eliminate, rook recaptures, and then go bishop f4, was this queen c6 move, using the fact that when the rook drops, you take here, this is why the rook went to e6, to take here, create the pin. Yes, the bishop drops back, drops the g file, prepares to take the queen, but after the queen retreats, bishop b7 coming, very dangerous bishop pair for black, 2-on-1 pawns here. Well, there is decent compensation, even though white's a bit better. But no rook e6 played, we see rook b4, and you'll see the evaluation bar does not like it, because now Magnus has got this awesome sacrificial combinations to rip open the black king. So you can start here with bishop takes on h6, also a great move. But Magnus plays this one. It shows the top move when I'm running with Stockfish 15 here, depth 23. When I was looking at Lichess earlier, it actually preferred starting with this bishop takes here. Both good moves, and here's the point. After pawn captures, Magnus crashes through, and it's all connected with the fact that all 5 of the black pieces here are on the queen side of the board. If you draw a line directly down the middle here, those pieces are on offside on the wrong side of the board. And so if you capture, well, there's check, and now wherever the king goes, the next move for white is the same. So you've got 3 options. Say you step here, attack the rook. Well, now you can double, you support that rook, and the attack just kind of plays itself. Bishop b7 is the top move, challenging this rook, and you just invade with the queen. You leave an entire rook to drop, because now another piece joins the party, and you're winning back your material by force. Yes, you're still a minor piece down, but the king is so exposed. So I'm just going to show you one sample line, I was clicking around on. The king gets hunted really nastily. You drive it around the board. There are many options, many moves. Some lead to mate. This particular line just leads to huge material loss. This is one sample line, and it's just completely game over. So this is why the attack is so huge. The bishop is immune, and Vincent carries on with bishop to f5. The material is level. We see bishop g5 played, threatening rook e7 invading. So queen d7 challenges the queen. The computer wants to exchange, top move, but I like how Magnus plays. Queen c3, keeping them on the board. The black king is more exposed, and he wants to win this game. So we get rook e4, challenging this key file. Now Magnus hops with the knight. Not the most precise move. You could have gone queen d5 here as black. Computer says that's best. But queen e6 played. Magnus now takes, bishop recaptures, and he brings his second rook over to this key e file. Bishop b7 back. So Vincent wants to stay on this long diagonal, look for queen d5 stuff. And so Magnus, he starts to play against it with knight to f3. Opens up his rook. The queen moves away, offers an exchange. Magnus refuses to take here. I mean, the pawns look absolutely horrible for black. This is definitely playable, knight e5 to come, but is it winning? Is it enough? Black's got the bishop pair. It's not entirely clear. There's a slip of the tongue. Clear. So Magnus, he keeps the queens on the board and goes for queen to e5, hitting the undefended rook, which slides to f8, pressuring down here, and so queen d6 now played, pressures the bishop on b6, and Vincent now decides to shatter Magnus's pawns, go for counterplay against the king here. So he takes on f3, the pawn recaptures, and now he goes bishop a5, hits the undefended rook. Magnus lifts it to rook e4, could have gone here, could have gone here, different ideas. This one forces the queen to move, queen f7 also possible, good move. This one eyes 2 pawns, and Magnus now plays bishop e3, just the kind of move you want on low time, keeping your king rock solid, pressuring this pawn. Vincent covers the pawn, and now great move by Magnus. If you capture on g6, it's slightly premature because you allow queen d1 check, and if the king steps to g2, you're walking into takes here, so king h2, queen takes, you're giving counterplay to black. So what do we see instead? Well, king g2, prophylaxis, the queen still holds the d1 square, so now queen f7 was played, hits this pawn, rook f4 intervenes, queen e8, and the rook is just snapped off by Magnus, queen recaptures, and he picks up a pawn. He's a pawn ahead, and Vincent's king's exposed, he's down on the clock. This is tough for the youngster. He goes for queen f7, the queen nudges back to g5, threatening this pawn, and now finally, after 3 days of play, 2 classical games, 3 tie breaks, this being the 4th, Vincent Keymer cracks. So he plays queen to d7, but simply drops this pawn, straight blunder. Magnus snaps it off, bishop recaptures, queen takes. Just running back, by the way, you know, there wasn't so much better. You can go queen f6, but Magnus can keep probing. But we get to here, and we're in an endgame now, which is just horrible for black. 2 pawns down, how do you hold this one? Well, Vincent tries, he gives the check, king h2, queen d3, hits this pawn. We get some checks from Magnus now, and he brings his queen around, holding everything together. Queen d6 check played, still pressuring this pawn. King g2, queen b6, and now Magnus starts running the h-pawn to rip open this black king. It gets exposed, sliding back to the centre. Magnus gives more checks, and now he starts running his f-pawn to get a second kind of thing going at the black king. Even though Keymer can now land some checks on Magnus's king, look how he drives it over to the other side of the board, and Magnus reaches here. This pawn soon to drop, so we get check. 2 pawns get swapped for one another, but after queen c5, here Vincent just blunders, but it's hopeless anyway. He gives the check, and Magnus blocks with a counter check against the black king, and here we see resignation. The queens are coming off, it's game over. But even if Vincent didn't blunder this queen d3 check, you know what to do. Queen f3 is the top move apparently, and Magnus can just carry on making steady progress. You know, king b6, advancing the pawn, steady, 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 it's game over. So this is the final position here. Vincent lost this game, but what a battle.
That's the reason why I'm highlighting these pieces, that suddenly there is so much harmony in Magnus's position. Just in 5 moves, that was true art.
Here we go. It's the last 16 of the Chess World Cup, and Magnus Carlsen is at it again, doing special things. So in this game, he's got the white pieces. It's day 1 of the 2 classical games, and his opponent is the legendary Vasil Ivanchuk. Let's see what happened. Magnus kicks off with d4, and we very quickly go down these moves of the Catalan opening with pawn to g3. An opening which Magnus prepped the hell out of for his World Championship match with Jan Nepomniachtchi. So he knows this stuff inside out. Now Vasil gives this check. You see it really commonly. It forces this bishop to block. I mean, not forced, but this is how the masters play. Then the bishop drops back. What's that all about? Well, this bishop is also going to have to move again to find a decent square, decent diagonal, and you've now taken away options from white of the bishop ever coming here. So we see bishop g2, and now here the main move is castles, but Vasil goes c6. Goes his own way, and we see that he's quite well prepared in this opening. So we get queen c2, knight bd7, now that bishop finds its optimal home. We see castles, and Magnus now bringing some fireworks, or relatively speaking, right? So he doesn't play the standard calm castles, he goes for pawn h4. How often now in Master Chess do we see these rook pawns just flying down the board, early doors, gaining space? Now you give up this square, which is a weakness. What do you get in return for that? Well, okay, maybe Magnus is going to run it down one day, try and induce a weakness. Plus, it does add some kind of, not protection, but, you know, another piece on the g5 square. Can't find the words. And we'll see how that comes back later on. So Vasil now takes on c4. Best move, almost as if he was prepared that this might come. You know, he didn't carry on with a standard kind of b6 or getting the bishop out like that. We now see Magnus recapture that pawn. Knight d5 centralizes, hits this bishop, and Magnus now comes here, which the pawn affords him to do. You know, he can step into this battery. Now, the h6 pawn is moved and the dark squared bishops come off. This should favour white because now e4 from Magnus, the knight drops back, queen c3, and he wants to lock in this bishop as a bad piece. But Vasil finds a fantastic move now, and maybe Magnus overlooked this one in his preparation, because e5 comes on the board, looks like it shouldn't be possible, but suddenly Vasil's solving his opening issues, because the bishop can now stream out in future. But it begs the key question, what if you capture the pawn? This one's actually a gambit from black. How are you winning that back? Well, the key follow-up move is unusual. You know, if you go for anything like knight d7 to try win it back, well, white could be looking at f4 and things. So knight a4 is this unusual idea. And the queen, you know, can't find a lovely home. Because if you come to the d file to hold the pawn, hit the knight, then b5 can protect the knight, and soon you're running into some nasty stuff here. So there's different lines, but queen d6 is the best one for white. You try and get the queens off, but queen e8, you know, crazy looking stuff. But actually, there's this threat now, so what's the best move here? Yeah, castles, and now the knight can actually take the pawn. Sorry, that's one move, castles, and the knight takes the pawn. But is the best move, yeah. But if you go for b3, this is a problem, because now you run into bishop to g4, and after this knight is taken, there's rook to d8, this rook's coming down, you're getting sourced down here, that's going to be checkmate, or you've got to give your queen up. There's various kind of lines like this. You know, what if you don't go b3? What if you go queen to a3 to cover the pawn? Well, then black takes on e5. It's really amazing the kind of counterplay that black generates if you actually try and win that pawn. So if we run it all the way back here, Magnus just doesn't go in for it. He doesn't take the pawn, he sees the danger, and he instead castles the king. So Vasil now takes on d4, we get queen recaptures, potentially giving this knight a square there, you know, it keeps some options open. Knight c5 is now played, and this is where Magnus now just unleashes the positional magic, right? So he plays the extraordinary move of rook a to c1, and this puts a question to this knight, because it's now attacked twice. Are you going to capture this pawn, which was possible, but not played by Vasil Ivanchuk? Why didn't he do it? Well, then the rook slides back, pins the knight to the queen, and you have to go f5 to hold on to it. Knight c3 intensifies pressure, rook d8 kicks the queen, this is the top line, it can drop back here, and after knight d5 hitting both pieces, white's forced to take, pawn recaptures, and black is a clean pawn up here. But none of that was exactly fully obvious. You know, you create new weaknesses when you push f5. Are you even going to be able to hold on to the pawn or just end up with weaknesses? And even this position here, the computer gives level. There's huge pressure on this pawn. It may be dropping in the future. Black's making lots of weaknesses around the king. So maybe Vasil should have taken the plunge, but he didn't do it. He backed down, he went for knight to a6, not knight e6 by the way, because he wants to develop the bishop like this, and now Magnus, watch the harmony of the next 5 moves. We get knight b to d2, bishop g4 from Vasil, really logical moves, using that weakened square due to h4. Now bishop f1, coming back to eyeball here. Great activation of the bishop now that the knight covers its brother. We get rook a d8, the queen drops back, knight c7, this one is attacked, and now pawn a4 from Magnus, preparing a5 to drive back that knight, and so it drops all the way back to c8. You know, you can't go a5, that one's going to drop off. So it drops back, a5, and this is the clip of Peter Lecco now talking about just the beauty of what Magnus has done to the position.
That's the reason why I'm highlighting these pieces, that suddenly there is so much harmony in Magnus's position. Just in 5 moves, that was true art.
And now, having turned things around, watch how Vasil now starts to go wrong. So he takes on f3, which was not the best move. What he should have done here is just start with rook f to e8. Now, why does he take? Well, he wants to go a6, but if you do it straight away, which we see in the game, then knight e1 comes, and it's heading for d3, c5, and that's a nasty looking knight, then peering over the ramparts at the b7 pawn. The a5 pawn creates a clamp. So this is why Vasil chops the knight off, at least this is what it seems to me. The knight recaptures, and then he goes a6. And now if you try knight e1, same plan, well, there's too much pressure on this pawn after knight d6. You know, you haven't got a second knight on d2 defending it, so you'd have to start going bishop g2, pieces heading in the wrong direction. So instead, Magnus now goes rook a4. Great attacking idea. Preparing e5, and then look at how this rook could swing into the attack. So we get rook fe8, and the pawn kicks on. Gives up the d5 square, yes, but Magnus simply drops away, and he's got this beautiful cramp and a big attack coming. Now he wants to go here, followed by bishop d3 and deliver some kind of mate, or force g6, then you've got h5. But if you do this right now, it's premature, because you allow this knight out of the box onto the d6 square. You can't take due to this pin. So that's why no queen e4, queen b3 instead, but similar ideas, because after knight a7, heading for b5, we get bishop d3, heading for b1, queen c2, nasty stuff. And after, knight b5 now played. I was going to say after knight b5, Magnus goes bishop b1. But one thing to show, Vasil should go knight c7 here, best defense. Now after bishop b1, knight e6, queen c2, knight f8. He's got time to hop it round and defend this square. And they say knight on f8, no mate, right? But he goes knight b5. Now we get bishop b1, and he goes for this construction with the pawns, which is really ugly. Pawn on g6. Look at this huge attack for Magnus. So he has different attacking ideas here. One awesome one was g4, using the rook to swing across. Big attack. Really nice ideas there. But Magnus goes for bishop a2, also good, threatening to crash through on g6 with the queen. So king g7 played to cover that pawn, step out of the pin. Now we get knight g5, pressuring f7, so rook f8 played, and e6. Magnus chucks the kitchen sink at Vasil, the last one of his pieces, flying into the attack. f6 played to drive back the knight, but it doesn't even move to start with. Bishop b1 now from Magnus, and the knight is immune. If you capture, this attack is just completely overwhelming. King h8, you take another pawn with check, king g8, and rook e5 is a key attacking move. Now black does have rook d5 to stop that one, then you take anyway, pawn recaptures, and now look what you've opened up. The h-file's coming. I mean, it's just slow motion devastation. If you take here, then this is the line. Queen g7, now this check, the king can't run away. This is one similar, one sample line, you know, the knight drops off. And say you never took that pawn, you know, coming back here, knight d6 is the top computer defense. We're now still rook h4, still queen g7, still this bishop check, king here, bishop back. And now because you didn't eliminate the pawn, there's pawn e7 running through. You can't take, you get mated. If the rook goes, you can take. And this position is just overwhelming. The computer says b4, best move, is plus 11 for white. Just huge attack. Still these dangerous pawns, and the rook is worth more than the knights in this position. So coming back here, f5 played to blunt out this battery. Now we see queen c1, and just another devastating idea. Knight f7, queen h6, check, and then leading to mate is what Magnus is setting up. So Vasil, he goes for rook d5 as a defensive try, heading for rook c5 here, and if the knight now jumps to f7, well, you are in time to take this pawn on e6, you're doing okay. So we see bishop a2 instead, hits the rook, it slides to c5, hits this queen. Magnus jumps to e3, now we see knight d5, and he simply nudges back to d2. There's new threats now on this knight, tons of pressure building, b4 could be on the cards. Vasil tries rook f6. Now if you go for knight f7, still doesn't work because the pawn drops. You know, you can't actually now bring the queen in here. The knight's simply dropping. And so instead, Magnus plays pawn b4, and the clumsy positioning of that rook is coming back to bite Vasil. So he goes for rook c3, and now Magnus simply chops. Pawn recaptures, queen takes, and there's big problems because even though black can go f4, look for the counterplay stuff, Magnus can always get these queens off the board if he wants to do so, and he simply takes this pawn, and you can't even capture back. Vasil doesn't do this because now you can check from here. The black king is just ripped open, queen can block, but here's a sample line, the pawn is running through, here you win a minor piece, winning endgame for white. Just a hopeless position. So rook f5 played, Magnus goes queen e4, and it actually led to resignation. There's a big threat here to go rook d1 to d7. I mean, Magnus is attacking here and a pawn up, all the positional advantages. You know, he hasn't even had to sacrifice for this huge attack. Vasil had had enough, throws in the towel. Really an exceptional masterpiece from Magnus Carlsen. Okay, so who did what again? We'll stick around to the end because we've got a classic finish to this World Cup match between Magnus Carlsen and D. Gukesh. Just scintillating, tense chess of the highest quality. Now Carlsen was playing with the black pieces, Gukesh with white, mouth-watering encounter, and already the opening is exciting here. So we get d4, knight f6, and bishop f4, the London system from Gukesh, playing it against a man who knows his London. But wait, look at Magnus's time. He spends 5 minutes on this move. He's out of book. No, he's just thinking about what to play, right? And he goes for an offbeat system with pawn b6, not fighting for the centre. Now Gukesh goes knight c3. Normally you see this pawn triangle, classic London pawn structure. This kind of setup is known as the Jabava London system, named after Badur Jabava, who played it a lot. Now, why is Gukesh doing this? Well, he's going for a quick central advance. So bishop b7 from Magnus, and now f3. So going hard for e4, taking the centre, and Magnus now still doesn't fight for it. He's playing with fire, and after e4, he makes another pawn move, pawn to a6. What's that all about? Well, he wants to stop knight b5, pressuring this pawn, forcing something nasty like knight a6 or whatever. Now we see queen d2, and it's really aggressive stuff from Gukesh. He wants the castle queenside. Let's blow the former world champion off the board. Now finally Magnus fights for the centre, and how many of us are playing e5 here, especially in a blitz game or anything, right? Just a classic looking move, drive back the knight, and it's definitely playable. It's a good move, it's just a different pawn structure. Black's going to go for c5, but Gukesh, he castles the king. He's got something completely different in mind, and this is a pawn sack if Magnus wants to take it. And Magnus burning time out of the opening here. Now Magnus didn't, as you can see, the board's gone light grey. This is analysis mode. Why not? Well, after captures, if you win that pawn, there's this silent killer move of queen to e3. Now you hit the bishop. Say it retreats to that starting square it came from. Looks very natural. Well, when you moved that queen, you opened up this rook and you lined up the queen with the king. So d5 is very powerful. You can't take with the queen, of course, you're going to lose your queen. You can't take with the pawn, and if you take with the bishop, well, c4 is a killer. That piece is actually dropping off. It's pinned to the queen, of course. So this is why the pawn wasn't captured. You know, there's a few different variations, but that's the basic theme. Don't rip open the position when your king's not castled. So Magnus goes for bishop to b4, developing, preparing to castle, and now Gukesh once again could play e5 to take the pressure off the centre, which this bishop is adding to. But instead he goes for pawn to a3, inviting Magnus to chop. Queen recaptures and then letting his centre crumble. Now he's attacking this c7 pawn with bishop and queen, as we can see, but Magnus doesn't play a passive move like pawn to c6, or else white can continue with bishop d3 or queen e1, some kind of move to hold the centre together, and is doing well. So Magnus correctly takes on e4, and now Gukesh's follow-up is explosive. So if you take this pawn immediately, the problem now is black can go queen d5. And you blockade this d pawn, you also keep an eye here, and if white tries bishop c4 to dislodge the queen, you can come to g5 with check. Black's doing okay, but it's all holding on by a thread. So instead of taking immediately, Gukesh goes for pawn to d5, really blowing open all of the pieces here. Now I had all the lines actually worked out to click right, and the bloody thing crashed, so I'm going to have to show you them from scratch. But here's what's going on. If you take with the bishop, now you're running into trouble with bishop takes on c7. You hit the queen, and after it slides away, there are now two pieces attacking this square. So white can take this pawn, and if bishop takes, well, the rook crashes down, you have to give up the queen. And if knight takes here, well, now this queen takes on g7. The moment the knight moves, that's what you run into. This is the problem. And if you do queen f6, theme of which we see in the game, well, this time white can capture, knight recaptures, and pawn to c4 drives back the bishop, and this time you win a rook. Oh, actually, some of my lines are still here. Good, okay. Anyway, so that's the problem with taking with the bishop. The knight takes in the game. If you go with the pawn, well, this time you get a line like this. White picks up that pawn, and although the black centre looks impressive, it's actually going to crumble soon, and white's doing a bit better here. Bishop pair on an open board. So coming back here, bishop takes, not working. Pawn takes, no good. So Carlsen goes knight takes, best move. He's hitting both of these pieces, and so queen takes on g7 is the only follow-up, and Carlsen also finds the only follow-up of queen to f6. So he defends the rook through this x-ray on the white queen, and he hits this bishop, you know, threat to take with check. So the queens are coming off the board, that one's forced, and now you can take here immediately, although then knight beats d7, maybe the black king gets castled. So Gukesh flicks in bishop to e5 to stop the king castling because it comes to defend the knight. If you go with this knight, by the way, it's a blunder. There's a tactic here. Do pause if you want to look for it. Sharpen up the tactics. So the move white can play is rook takes on d7. If king takes, your knight drops. You've got 2 minors for the rook. That's good. If knight takes, you pick up the rook. So king e7 forced to defend this knight. Now the bishop takes on c7, knight bd7, and here Gukesh already drops back his bishop, because if you take this pawn, the problem is you're activating this knight. It jumps in, it's now threatening a fork, and if you go knight h3, well, everything's getting really ugly. The rook's coming to the g-file, not the way to develop. So instead, bishop g3 on the board. Magnus goes rook h to g8, but the g-file is now blocked, and so bishop e2 can be played. Magnus delaying on the capture, by the way, because it's more awkward actually for black not to capture, force white to, you know, don't help white harmoniously develop. And now great move by Magnus, just prophylaxis of the highest quality. He goes king to e8, inviting this captures. You know, eventually Gukesh has to get this knight out, and now after knight takes, well, there's no bishop h4 check stuff. You know, he's the one now picking up tempos on pieces, And Gukesh has got a nasty decision now, how do you hold on to everything? So he goes bishop to f3, but he's now dropping his bishop pair on this open board, and after takes, Magnus is slightly better in this endgame. Now Gukesh has got a decision. He takes with the pawn. If he captures here, we get a very similar endgame. So rook a7 takes here. Where are we? Rook takes on b7. This one drops. This is where I've lost the line that I had already stored. And this is the kind of endgame you get, where we've still got the same pawn structure. 2 pawns for black against 1 over here. 2 on 3 on this side. Plus the 2 rooks, the knights. It's very similar to the game. What we got in the game was a capture here. So this is the way that Gukesh decided to play, not taking this bishop. Now we get captures, knight takes rook takes on h7. We get this liquidation, but Magnus doesn't actually win this pawn straight away because there's a nasty trick for white, which is knight to e5. Because if this knight takes, then you run into this skewer and you pick up the rook, you're in exchange ahead. And you don't want to allow this knight to activate, be on that pawn, be on the knight with the rook, everything like that, not good. So instead, king to e7 is played, stepping away from this tactical idea, and now knight d4 comes on the board. Again, there's some nasty ideas of checking down here, activating all the pieces, and so instead of grabbing a pawn, Magnus plays the best move of knight to e5. He activates his knight, covers this square, covers the f7 pawn, but what are you doing after it's attacked? Because you don't want to be moving it, then knight f5 check can be coming, picking up the rook, because that pawn would be pinned the moment the black knight moves. So Magnus, he counterattacks with rook to g4, and Gukesh can find nothing better here than to let the knights drop. It is the best continuation, and we enter into this endgame where, yes, the material's level. There was a threat to mate here, by the way, so c3 gives room, but the problem here for the white position is that this pawn here, the e pawn, is a passed pawn. This one's under more severe pressure than the f pawn, and these 2 pawns here, they keep these ones at bay just a little bit better. So watch how the game unfolds. Rook g8, pawn b4, b5, great demonstration of how 2 pawns can keep 3 at bay. And after king b3, we see one of the problems here, which is you want to go c4, but anytime you do it, you're running into rook g3 check, and then the pawn drops once the king retreats. Or if you block with a rook, then the g pawn drops. Big problems for Gukesh. So rook f g4 played, rook f2, rook 8 g7 now interrupts this attack, and even with a pair of rooks off the board, the problems persist. You can't go c4, rook g3 check, king goes, you win the pawn, rook blocks here, you win this pawn, or sorry, take first, then win the pawn, all these problems. So Gukesh pushes the a pawn, keeps the king blocked by the c pawn. We get pawn f5 from Magnus, takes here, now rook a2, and this is actually a decisive mistake from Gukesh. Now the computer wants c4 here, but this is bonkers, right? Because you're walking into check, and now if the king goes, okay, we're winning a pawn as said, that's terrible. So the computer wants to go rook f3, now check takes, king recaptures, rook takes here, and it says if you go rook b3, this can potentially be held, king d6. But, this is some craziness here. To a human player, giving those 2 pawns, plus this one's a bit further ahead, just doesn't look sensible. I mean, if you go b5 here, for example, you just lost the game, apparently, after rook g4 check. So in this position, you have to go rook d3 check, apparently. So to a human player, just giving up that pawn doesn't look logical. So Gukesh goes rook a2, now rook g5, from Magnus, preparing to meet this with this, laterally defending the pawn. Again, it was the computer's favourite way to play, but it involves a pawn sacrifice. So Gukesh goes for the more human check, the king comes up, now he comes back to a2, covering this pawn, and he's getting way down on time here. f4 from Magnus, 1 minute 45 now for Gukesh. We see rook c2, rook g3, and it's a miserable endgame. The king moves away, preparing c4. But after king e5, Gukesh doesn't even execute on it, because if you go down this route, Now we get captures, you've lost the pawn, and if you take, what's the line here? Sorry, then you lose this pawn. If you come behind, preparing to push, well now the king marches across, something like this, and there are various different lines where you start pushing away the white rook. What was the line I looked at here? Yeah, so c3 is the top line. Where does the rook go? Say it comes to b3 to stay with this pawn. Now there's king c4, I mean b6, the whole thing's brutal. Oh, and now there's a check. Okay, where's the king going? Okay, you have to stay with the rook. c2, okay, this one's going through first. Had my lines ready, lost them, sorry. But you can't go c4, it's just not working. So we get king b2, Gukesh just waiting around now. Magnus brings in the king, and this is instructive. He even ditches a pawn now. Gukesh does win his queenside pawn, but look how advanced Magnus's have got. The king comes all the way in, we get pawn e2, and now here, Gukesh actually resigns the game. It's not showing this on the left-hand side, usually does. Don't know what's going on with chess.com today, but if you come behind and check, then the king marches in. Yes, you can give another check, but ultimately this king comes all the way around, it's going through. And if you go king c2 to come round to the pawn like this, then don't make a queen. That would be stupid. You skewer, you lose your queen right. But what you can do instead is play rook e3. And this one's nice, because if check, king goes, you can take here, forced, or else the queen promotes. But after this one captures, look at the barrier those two pawns form. That's awesome. The pawn's going through, making a baby girl, and that's the game. So this is the final position. Who did it again? Magnus Carlsen. What did he do? Well, grind out an endgame that just looked fairly level, but he did his thing, made his opponent crack. We're into the World Cup semi-finals. Now, Magnus Carlsen, world number 1, was expected to get this far, but his opponent, Nijat Abasov from Azerbaijan, was not expected, being just a 2600 GM. I mean, I say just, incredibly strong player, but not in the 2700 club. So he's performed out of his skin. He's got the home crowd behind him. So even though Magnus is favourite, this is going to be a tense fight. Now Magnus kicks off here with e4, and we go into a Sicilian, which Abasov loves to play, and we get a tactical game on our hands. But watch the opening prep Magnus brings. So we go into this Rossolimo. Black now choosing the e6 variation. We get captures here by Magnus, shatters the pawn structure, and now he goes for b3, preparing to fianchetto this bishop, keeping an eye on c4, and now after d6 we get e5. Seen many times before, it gives a pawn but shatters the structure for black. Such a key theme in this opening, can white take advantage of the pawn structure? Now the most common move here is knight takes on e5. There's been various games from there. There are a couple of different queen moves can be tried after that, but Magnus does not take the pawn, he goes pawn d3. And as far as I can see in the chess.com and Lichess databases, this is a novelty. Can't find any games here. So he lets Abasov keep the pawn, it was protected with f6, and then he just carries on his slow development. What's Magnus got in mind? Well, after knight h6, developing, looking to come back here, keep an eye on some key dark squares, Magnus now unleashes it with rook to g1. He's not castling kingside, he's going for the throat in this game. Love it. So Abasov continues with bishop to a6. I mean, that is an ugly piece. Can't really find a good diagonal with these pawns being where they are. So it comes here, but how much future there? Well, it's preparing to chop a knight if it ever hopped. But Magnus now goes g4, cracking on with his plan. Knight f7, drops back, keeps an eye on the g5 push. Magnus could do it already, but he just carries on developing some pieces first with queen to e2. We get bishop e7, bishop b2, and now queen a5 starts to try and drum up counterplay on the queen side, and Magnus now plays a really practical move, pawn to c4. He shuts out two bishops at once because this one's now going nowhere. It stops this pawn ever moving, which hems in this bishop, so some nice positional ideas to it, even though it creates a backwards pawn on the d file here that black could attack later. And now g5 from Abasov. So with Magnus shutting down the queen side, he looks to do the same here, but Magnus insisting, let's open things up. Pawn h4, pawn h6 played. Rook h1 comes back to this file. That's where the action's now taking place. We see castles from black connecting the rooks, and now Magnus does the same, which looks slightly surprising on the surface, because black can now win a pawn. This wasn't done because king c2 is the follow-up. You prepare to bring these rooks here, so the queen has to come away so as not to get trapped. Rook a1, queen b6, bishop c3 threatens to skewer, win the exchange. So if the rook slides away, well then the game goes on from here. And long story short, white's actually a bit better here, despite being 2 pawns down, because the open a file is a big asset, plus obviously the pawn structure is a bit of a mess. So the pawn not taken, the queen just dropped back voluntarily, back towards the centre, and now knight e4 from Magnus, beautiful central outpost, and this is really a key moment of the game, because that knight looks so good, it got me wondering, well, why can't black go f5 here? Kick away that knight, you know, it can't hop here, can't hop here. Well, the computer shows that the knight should just drop back. This is the top move, and actually pushing this pawn was a big weakening of this diagonal, because now this pawn is really loose, the rook is unprotected. So say you capture here, for example, going after this knight, well, the knight can jump in, and there's threats to take here, open up the bishop. You can't take, of course, or you run into this fork or skewer, call it what we will, of these two pieces. So there's just lots of tricky problems for black to solve, plus this pawn's under fire by the queen. So we didn't see f5 played. Instead, we see takes on h4. Another really ugly move when we consider the pawn structure. I mean, look at that. 3 sets of double pawns. Horrible. But it is a decent move, because after knight recaptures, the rook now comes to this open g file, and if Magnus plays too passively, you know, say he just played a move like pawn f3 or something here, well, black is the one actually that could start seizing some initiative. But Magnus plays so energetically now with pawn to f4. Brilliant understanding of the position that he really shows with this move. Now what to do as black, you know, the centre's starting to crumble if you don't play actively, or f5 could come, create a monster square for the knight. So we see takes, best move, now knight recaptures here. This is Magnus's idea, you know, he's unleashed this monster. Now the bishop takes, that knight was an awful piece to deal with, attacking the rook, etc. Now we see takes with check, intermezzo, and after the king moves, you know, we don't see one of these pieces blocking. King b8 was best to now bring this bishop back into the game. Well, Magnus now picks up this bishop, and he starts threatening all of these pawns around here. You know, nasty piece to have in the position. So bishop c8 recycles into the game, looks at the g4 pawn, and now Magnus, he goes on the offensive with his own rook. Now he leaves this pawn hanging. This is such a tactical game, right? But why can't you take it? Well, now the rook invades. Hang on, can't this rook slide back, hold everything together, keep the knight on the board? Well, no, because queen takes. Yes, this one drops, but then this one drops, loose rook, and actually white is a minor piece ahead here. So taking the pawn, no good for black. We see rook d6, best move, does give this pawn here, which was weak and likely to drop at some point anyway, but it kicks back the queen, and black now takes here with tempo. The queen drops away, and rook e6. Good move. You have to be careful. You know, if you pick up this pawn, you've actually got problems here. The pieces are overloaded. So you can take here. You could have also started with taking there, but taking here is good. If rook recaptures, you do this, black is winning, minor piece ahead. If you take here, black is winning, still a piece ahead here. What is it? Yeah, one minor, rook ahead here even, I think, or rook and knight. Yeah, you're killing it. So you just can't go for that one. So the queen drops back, keeps an eye on this rook, and now we see knight e5. And things are getting dangerous for Magnus. You know, look at that monster in the centre of the board. Do you want to give up your bishop here? Well, what Magnus does first is king to c2. adding some protection here, coming away from any discovered checks from that knight, and it looks like there could be a fork here. You know, what if takes and then look and land something here? Well, you can actually take here into mezzo, skewering the queen to the rook, so you have to take back, then your rook drops, you're in exchange down. So the king comes up to b7, gets away from these tricks. Now we see rook e3 from Magnus, covering some key squares. We see queen e7 attacking this knight on the edge of the board, so it hops into f5, hits the queen, targets the pawn, queen g5 hits the knight, threatens rook g2. You have to be so on your toes in this game, right? And so Magnus now chops off one of these attacking black pieces. Abasov flicks in this rook to g2, skewers queen to king, so the rook has to block. We see an exchange, queen recaptures, and now the queen takes here. Very logical, keeping this pin. Plus you've got opposite colour bishops. Could that give some drawing chances? Well, the challenge here for Abasov after rook to h5, queen f7 is, even though the computer gives it roughly level here, black has to be careful because the pawn structure is a mess, and if white starts attacking, there's less pawns to shield that king. So we see queen h2 now played from Magnus. But wait, this is an absolute blunder. But it's so not obvious to see why it's a blunder. What he had to do was actually keep his queen back on this square in contact with f1, maybe play a move like king b2 or c3. Why is this a problem? Was the amazing shot for black of queen to f1, but really not an easy idea to spot. You know, you leave this pawn hanging, for example. Why can't white just take there? The bishop's still covered. Well, then you can chop, queen recaptures, and queen e2 check simply picks up the bishop. So that's no good. You know, after queen f1, you cannot take that pawn. And what else to do if you play a nothing move? Black's got this threat of rook g6 and rook g2, and you just can't fight against that. It's game over. So the best defense here is queen d2, but then still rook g6, and if rook h2, rook g1. This time the queen's coming here, and it's basically just all over for white when you start analysing it through. Crazy attacking resource, but Abasov misses the whole invasion idea. He goes to rook g6, really understandable not to see that, opening up his bishop now, but now Magnus can just consolidate. Bishop f4, we see rook f6 back, hitting that piece, but Magnus finds this awesome move of bishop e3, and Abasov said to Magnus after the game he'd missed this one. This is what Magnus said in interview. The bishop covers the square, no invasion anymore, also attacks this pawn. We see bishop f5 and the pawn drops off. You know, you couldn't defend it like this, or this one drops. Too hard to hold on to as a doubled weak pawn, and now queen g6 played, hits d3, but Magnus ignores with king to c3, because if black captures, well, this is a huge attack. Really thematic idea. If the king captures, you decoy it away, check, wherever the king goes, the rook closes the trap. So there's big problems now for black. You're under fire. So we see rook e6 played, looking to invade on e6 here. But still, Magnus had a winning move, which he saw after the game. As soon as he played this one, he could still go bishop takes on a7. And it's a winning tactic. Again, for these reasons mentioned, the king is too exposed, but this time you check from f2. King goes and you pick up the bishop here. That's a lost endgame, 2 pawns down, plus the white ones are connected. But what Magnus does here is rook to h4. And now bishop g4 is possible, threatening rook e2, invading, kicking the queen. But Magnus, he now takes on a7. And this is almost winning, except in one amazing variation, which Magnus spotted at the board. Again, he mentioned this afterwards. So there's this crazy resource of queen g7 check. Now, it looks impossible, because the bishop can come back and block the check. You've just won a pawn for nothing, 2 pawns upright, still an attack going to come against the king. But here's the amazing resource for black, queen to g5. And not only do you pressure this rook, so things like rook e2 add some danger, you know, if the queen moves off the h-file, the rook drops, but also you look at this d2 square. So there's this huge threat now to go rook e2, kick the queen away, and then land queen d2 checkmate. So you can move this bishop away somewhere. You know, the computer says bishop b6, which is kind of crazy. You can take, then what does it say? Queen b8 check, start forcing some kind of perpetual. But long story short, it doesn't give white as winning the position anymore. Amazing resource. But Abasov goes queen f6 check, not g7. So now you can slide away with the king. And how do you stop this huge attack on the black king here? Because once again, if you capture, you're running into this and you're picking up this huge attack once you recapture the bishop. You can chuck a pawn but does nothing, queen recaptures. There's this huge threat now to basically bring the rook in on this rank, and if rook e7, well then you can check from here, king b7, and the rook invades to the back rank. You've got tons of problems to deal with. So what we see from Abasov, not capturing the bishop, but rook e5 to stop this queen invading like this. But now simply d4 and everything's overloaded. Magnus didn't even capture the unprotected bishop. The rook has to move surely, you know, come back to e8 to cover this check here. But then you can take on g4, still a huge attack, still this bishop is immune because of the invasion. And if you don't retreat the rook here, which we didn't see in the game, if you give the check and c5, well then still what to do, the rook's got to move. Yes, you can cover this one like this, but then you're running into mate in 2 with queen b8 check, king a6, and that shuts the trap. So this was the final position. Abasov chucks in the towel. So it's with a tinge of sadness that I have to inform you, this is the final game that I'm going to bring you as a daily recap of the Chess World Cup 2023. Because this game was decisive. It was the first of 2 tiebreak games between Pragg and Magnus, and then the second one was drawn, so the winner of this game is going to be the winner of your World Cup 23. And what a month it's been, what a tournament. I hope you've enjoyed these recaps. Do let me know in the comments, do like the video if you've done so, hugely appreciated. Now let's jump into this one and see what happens in this exciting climax. So Pragg kicks off with e4, and after e5, both knights developing, no surprises with bishop c4, the Italian game. Magnus goes knight f6, we get d3, bishop c5, and now the first mini surprise, Pragg goes pawn a4. Unusual to push the rook pawn so early in the game. You normally see something like c3 or castles. So what's Pragg up to? Well, trying to just unsettle Magnus. Now we get castles and pawn a5. Magnus decides he's going to grab some space. And now bishop e3 already signals some aggressive intentions from Pragg. Because Magnus captures, the pawn takes back. Why would Pragg voluntarily shatter his structure? Well, he's opened the f-file to attack, and with the pawn now moving to e3, you free up this diagonal for the queen to activate into the attack. So we get castles, knight b to d2, and knight e7 from Magnus. Great remaneuver, not going with rook e8. You know, you want that rook to stay with the defense of the pawn, and you have to start going for this central counterplay to play against Pragg's attack. So knight h4 starts the direct attack on the king. We get c6 and queen e1. Such a thematic attacking idea. d5 from Magnus, and the bishop just drops back. And you might wonder, why doesn't black take here and shatter this white structure? Well, a couple of reasons. One, you've just opened this bishop to laser down on your king, and 2, black is a bit behind in development to start opening the center. So already, if you play a natural move like knight g6, white can swap, bring the queen, and you actually attack 2 pawns at once, because this one's pinned and you can't defend both. White is significantly better. Just one sample line. So no takes from Magnus. He maintains this great center and goes queen d6, trying to develop, connect rooks, and adding some protection to this pawn. He also laterally covers this knight, because sometimes white's smashing there to open up the king. Very thematic exchange sack in the right position. So queen g3 played, carrying on the attack, and Magnus now spends some time correctly. Look at the clock times, but now knight h5, Magnus uses about 5 minutes. It's a critical position, he's under fire. Now this is a good move because he kicks this queen away. There were ideas even for white of d4, using the fact this pawn is pinned, you know, the queen's unprotected, and after this queen moves, he now goes g6, and Pragg just shows some inexperience here. He doesn't react to how the position has changed. He carries on launching the pieces forward, but actually the quieter move of dropping back the knight was the order of the day. But such a tough move to play. You're going in the opposite direction, you're blocking your rook. This knight's not coming into the game. But the point is, you pressure this pawn here, black goes f6, but you're just inducing weaknesses around the king. And after, say, bishop e6, d4 is a great move, opening up the game, trying to use the fact that this king is a tiny bit more loose, and these knights are kind of poised to spring into the attack, is a bit better for white. So that was the way to go, but Pragg jumps in. Very understandable. He's pressuring the knight on e7. No takes, of course. I mean, the pawn is pinned, plus this one's loose. So Magnus chops off that attacking piece. We get pawn recaptures, and now a great move. Maybe Pragg underestimated this one. King g7, vitally important defensive move. You can't let white go f6 and squash your position. So what does Pragg do instead? Well, he just goes wrong and plays a bit too softly. So he plays king to h1, but rook a to e1 was the order of the day, because it fights against this next idea. After queen f6, offering the exchange, Pragg would like to go queen g4, but then in this line, after knight takes, you've got a problem, because you want to go e4, you know, use this pin to the queen and everything like that, but knight e3 comes on the board, hitting both of these, and this is why the rook is better on e1. That move's not available for black. So if the rook's on e1, the knight can't go there, has to drop here to hit the queen like that. This is the whole point. This is why you can take and allow e4, because you've got this counter attack on the white queen here, but then there's queen d7. You know, it's very, very subtle stuff. But you can invade with the queen, you hit the pawn. White's a bit, oh no, sorry, black's a bit better apparently here, but white would be a bit better if the rook's on e1. Kind of deep stuff, but it was the way to go. King h1, now no queen g4 in good circumstances, so Pragg has to change, and this is a good endgame for Magnus. Why? Because Magnus has got the centre here, blunting the bishop, so Pragg strikes, we get captures from Magnus, not forced, but still a good way to go. Pawn recaptures, and Pragg has got 1, 2, 3 pawn islands. Magnus has only got the 2 pawn islands. He's slightly better, and rook a to d8 shows his small initiative here. So Pragg covers the knight with rook f2. You know, the knight has to stay with the pawn. We get rook d4, pressuring that pawn. This rook doubles, saying, okay, if you take here, I'm going to chop and crash through here. Magnus doesn't want that. So instead, he drops back his knight, covers this one, looks a bit passive, but he's got plans to untangle. We get pawn c3, kicks back this rook. Now rook e2, covering this pawn, preparing knight c4, rook e7 from Magnus, he covers his own weakness here, and now Pragg could already hop with knight c4, but he starts with some prophylaxis, bishop c2. I mean, he does take pressure off here, it's very cat and mouse, but he adds some cover here. Now knight d7 from Magnus, you know, that pawn's not dropping anytime soon, so Magnus remaneuvers, knight c4, rook a8, looks a bit passive, but it's not permanent, you know, b5's coming, and now Pragg here plays a very committal move. So you can just go knight d6 here, pressure the pawn, the knight can come, game goes on from here. You know, what are the white plans here? Rook ef2 is one move the computer calls out. But what Pragg does is pawn to g4. Very, very committal, ambitious move, looking to clamp with g5. But look at how you weaken f4. Critical weakness now. Now the best move for black to exploit this is jump out with the knight, because if the pawn kicks on, you gain access here, and if you defend that pawn simply, well then knight c5, coming to e6 and f4. Nasty weakness Pragg has created. But what Magnus does is f6, a bit reactive. Is Pragg turning things around? Because now rook g2, knight h6 and g5, and white is now better according to the engines. So the pawn is taken, rook recaptures, knight f7 kicks back the rook, it drops to the second rank, and Magnus goes rook e6, trying to cover his weak points. Also the knight jumps. Rook d2 pressures this knight. Where is it going? Magnus under pressure here, but he finds a great defensive resource of rook to f6, and Pragg is starting to get down on time. So you've no time to take here, or your rook drops with check. So we see captures on f6, the knight recaptures, and now pawn b4 is a great move by Pragg, trying to get something going on the queen side. If this one ever drops like this, very, very dangerous. But Magnus here, cool as a cucumber, time on his clock, finds an excellent king re-maneuver. He starts with king f8. We see king g2 in response and king e7, covering some key squares. No knight d6 jumps, really awesome stuff. And after a5, creating the bind on this pawn, rook h8 from Magnus. Horrible move to face in the time pressure. The rook is invading, pressuring this pawn. Here come the knight, whoops. Here come the knights heading for this square. Knight g5 on the cards. Ugly, horrible position for white. We see rook e2 trying to cover weaknesses, anticipating this. Knight h5 from Magnus though, preparing to fork. The king steps back. Knight f4 anyway, rook d2 and rook h3. The invasion is horrendous. Pragg is down to barely seconds for these moves. He's getting 10 seconds back a move, but barely any time. And now the best move, according to the engine, is bishop d1. Hugely difficult move to find in time pressure. Still black is better, moves like rook c3. But the idea is you cover some key attacking squares, but so much pressure still to come. But what Pragg does here is pawn a6, a desperate kind of move to shatter these pawns and create a weakness here on c6, which he now attacks. But Magnus starts invading. He could go knight g5 immediately, but he starts with rook c3. Rook c2, the best defensive move for Pragg. Still black is better, but Pragg goes knight a5. Pressuring this pawn, you're going to get a check, looks great, but there's a big problem, and it starts with knight g5 threatening a fork, so the king sidesteps, rook sidesteps, trying to get a trade-off. Now you get knight here, check, king f1, and the rook sidesteps to a3. You've got huge problems. You're either going to win a piece or you're threatening mate. If you cover the mate threat, well now the bishop drops. If you don't, if you check, king sidesteps, well this is what we see in the game, then now you're just in a world of pain. How do you stop the mate? The knights are covering all three of the squares. There's just nothing to be done. I mean, say you could put your bishop here and the pawn's not going to capture it. Well, you can simply checkmate like this, rook blocks, and this is a mate on the board. So Pragg could do nothing. He's either getting mated or losing a piece. He resigns the game. Magnus then had white in game 2, but he just shut the game down. Nothing Pragg could do, and so Magnus Carlsen becomes the World Cup champion 2023. This now completes his resume. He's won everything, most things multiple times, but this one has eluded him. He's truly cemented himself with the GOAT status, in my opinion, right? Exceptional tournament. I am pleased for him to get this one in the crown. What a player we've seen in the last, decade and a half. Magnus Carlsen, take a bow. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed these recaps. Thanks very much for watching. Do hit like and subscribe to never miss a future one.